The British royal family is a subject of attraction around the world. Millions of tourists flock to the UK and London all year round to visit the numerous historic locations associated with the monarchy. Their lives are consistently on display in the media, covered and speculated by national newspapers, and dramatised in TV adaptations like Netflix's The Crown. Arguably, the most followed aspects of the royal family have been the love stories, the relationships, the tragedies, royal babies and marriages, with the wedding of Prince William and Catherine Middleton, for example, peaking at a total of 36.7 million viewers. This infatuation with the royals has been aided by the emergence of social media and the internet. However, it was present over half a century before, near the dawn of the late Queen's reign. The story of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, is a tale of love and duty. Their marriage in 1923 marked the beginning of a partnership characterized by mutual respect and affection. Elizabeth's steadfast support was crucial to George VI, especially after he unexpectedly ascended to the throne in 1936, following his brother Edward VIII's abdication. Despite his initial reluctance and struggles with a stammer, Elizabeth's encouragement and dedication helped him navigate his royal duties and boost his confidence. Together, they provided a strong sense of stability and continuity for the British monarchy during the tumultuous years of World War II and beyond. Their bond was not only a personal source of strength for George VI, but also a cornerstone of their public service, endearing them to the British people. What follows is the journey of how their romance and devotion grew, and what ultimately concluded the royal love story of Elizabeth and George. Prince Albert was born in the winter of 1895, the second eldest son to King George V and Mary of Teck. Terrorised by his father and overshadowed by his gregarious elder brother and heir to the throne, Edward, Bertie grew into a shy and quiet figure.
George VI was quiet as a child. He had a good relationship with his other siblings, but he wasn't as excitable as his older brother, Edward. Albert was a more withdrawn figure, closer to his father than his other brothers, and in keeping with his father's interests, he enjoyed the quiet life away in the countryside, out of the public eye.
Illnesses and a lack of confidence plagued Bertie's childhood. The young prince suffered the indignity of wearing leg braces to correct his knock knees, and at the age of 8, he began to develop a stammer, an ailment which would haunt him for most of his life.
George VI was the opposite of his brother Edward growing up. He was Albert, he was known as Bertie. He was shy, he was retiring, while his brother was outgoing. He wasn't as good looking as Edward, he wasn't as well dressed, he wasn't as charismatic, he didn't have the same success with women.
Edward's relationship with his younger brother Bertie was very warm when they were younger boys. There was very little between them in terms of their age, and they grew up best of friends. However, as the two men grew older, life became a bit more difficult. George had a very specific way that he wanted to live. He was much more of a kind of private figure. He was more withdrawn in terms of his public image. He didn't have the sort of the charisma and the glamour that was possessed by his older brother Edward. He didn't have a great deal of confidence. And the reason why he didn't have a great deal of confidence was because he had a stammer. Now, psychologists have sought to try and explain the stammer in relation to the fraught relationship that the royal children had with the king, with their father, George V, growing up. The young Bertie growing up had been almost terrified by his father and the expectations that his father had imposed on him.
George V was very much an old-fashioned patriarch. He was somebody who believed not just in the idea of spare the rod and spoil the child, but also in the very Victorian idea that children should be seen and not heard. So of his 4 sons, the 2 eldest, later Edward VIII and George VI, had a very difficult relationship with him because he was this cold figure and his wife Mary was cold as well. And it's very much a sense that everyone was brought up in a way to understand duty, and the idea of duty as the central tenet of what you were suspected to do as a royal prince was something that he laboured home intensively.
As a young man, Albert attended the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, and at the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, he was dispatched with the Collingwood and was present at the Great Naval Battle of Jutland in the summer of 1916. With this, Prince Albert became the first member of the royal family to serve on the front lines of war in over 200 years, an accolade which would be admired greatly during his reign.
He served in World War I. He was somebody who was the first member of his own family to have done so, to have served on active service. He had a great respect for the armed forces, and you can see that if he never had become king, he would have been one of those figures within the royal family who was always well-liked, whose debilitating stammer meant that public speaking was a nightmare for him. But in private life, he was absolutely fine. He wasn't somebody who was affected by it to the extent that he was publicly.
He didn't have a great deal of confidence. He wasn't as outgoing as other members of his family, and a bit more withdrawn. I think in that respect, we can understand why later on he would be a more reluctant figure when it came to becoming king.
As a character, he was a much less likely king than Edward ever was, because he was somebody who didn't seem to be very comfortable around people.
Without freedom, there can be no enduring peace, and without peace, no enduring freedom.
Born second in line to the throne, his parents drilled a sense of duty into him from a young age. On the 4th of June 1920, King George V bestowed the title of Duke of York upon Bertie. He consequently began to take on more and more royal duties. Representing his father, Bertie acquired the nickname of the Industrial Prince, as he often toured coal mines and factories, taking a great interest in industrial work. However, Prince Albert's stammer soon became a major source of embarrassment for him, as well as the royal family. King George V regularly became frustrated with his son's affliction. Bertie would soon begin to seek a wife who could help carry the heavy burden of royal life and relieve his family's expectations. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was the youngest daughter and the 9th of 10 children of Claude Bowes-Lyon, Lord Glamis, later the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, and his wife Cecilia Cavendish Bentinck. She spent her early childhood at St Paul's Waldenbury in Hertfordshire, north of the capital. This was the country home of her parents. When her father inherited his earldom in 1904, she became Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. Elizabeth enjoyed her childhood, unlike her husband. It was a time of happiness, fun, and filled with a deep sense of love and security. Lady Elizabeth's mother encouraged her children's education in the arts and culture. She was educated at home, and by the age of 10 she was fluent in French. When the First World War started, coincidentally on her 14th birthday, Glamis Castle became a hospital. Although Lady Elizabeth was too young to work as a nurse, she did assist with welfare work with the patients. As well as caring for the troops, Lady Elizabeth also played a significant part in rescuing the castle's contents during a severe fire on the 16th of September, 1916. 2 soldiers discovered a fire in a room under the castle roof. As they ran to raise the alarm, the first person they came across was Lady Elizabeth, who kept calm and immediately telephoned both the local and Dundee fire brigades. She then marshalled everyone to fight the fire and organised a chain to bring buckets of water from the river. Later, with the fire raging above them, she organised the removal of the valuables out onto the lawn. One of the soldiers she treated wrote in her autograph book that she should be hung, drawn and quartered. Hung in diamonds, drawn in a coach and quartered in the best house in the land. She fulfilled her mother's maxim, that duty is the rent you pay for life. Lady Elizabeth was not particularly fashionable or a great beauty, yet men adored her. She was a petite, dark-haired and blue-eyed debutante, elegant with a beautiful smile. She was powerful, confident and funny, with a strong personality and an incredible flirt, yet remained proper at all times. Exactly what Prince Albert needed.
Bertie found his closest confidant and greatest supporter in his wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon.
From childhood, Lady Elizabeth and her older sisters had been friendly with the children of King George and Queen Mary. Occasionally, members of the royal family stayed at Glamis Castle. Prince Albert fell in love with Elizabeth in classic fairy tale style after laying eyes on her from across a crowded London ballroom floor. However, it wasn't going to be smooth sailing when it came to winning over Elizabeth's heart. Royal life offered little to a wealthy aristocrat's daughter.
After a number of unsuccessful attempts to woo her and propose marriage to her, she eventually consented.
It's really interesting that people often ask why Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was so vituperative towards Wallis Simpson. And I think the answer for that is because she was envious of her.
There was some talk at the time about whether she was in fact more interested in his older brother, Edward, Prince of Wales, and that was one of the reasons why she originally turned Bertie down.
She actually wanted to marry Edward, and her mother was very keen on that idea. And it's little known, but Bertie had to propose to Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon 3 times before she accepted. So there's the sense that she married the lesser man. Of course, he became the greater man and he became king, but she can't have known that when she married.
Elizabeth reportedly said to a friend that it was my duty to marry Bertie and I fell in love with him afterwards. Despite their different personalities, the couple shared so much. They both had a strong sense of duty, were deeply religious, and over time had affectionate love for one another.
1923, he wed the lovely Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in the wedding of the season. Together they toured the various dominions of the empire and seemed supremely happy. As the Duke of Kent, without the heavy sword of kingly responsibilities hanging over his head, young George led a carefree life. Possessing the common touch, he soon became a beloved figure in English life.
The couple were married on the 26th of April, 1923, in Westminster Abbey and became the Duke and Duchess of York. It's said that Elizabeth lightened the whole royal family with her radiant smile and warm sense of humour. George V was described as always in a good temper whenever Elizabeth was around. The newlywed couple embodied everything that was best about the monarchy in this period and presented themselves as very dutiful figures.
His relationship with his wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who later became Queen Elizabeth, was, one doesn't want to sentimentalise these things, but it was a very happy relationship. The two of them had known each other for many years, very, very much in love. It was a very conventional match. I mean, unlike Edward and his various mistresses and Ben Wallis, there was no question that they would get married. They got married and had 2 daughters. And essentially it gave him a stability and a happiness that he'd always wanted. She was a more dominant figure than he was, just as Wallis was a more dominant figure than Edward was. But she was also somebody who loved him and was keen that he be kept away from the more taxing aspects of royal life.
Nevertheless, she would get married to Bertie. They would become the Duke and Duchess of York, and really they embodied everything that was best about the monarchy in this period, in that they presented themselves as very dutiful figures. They went out into public life. They toured towns and cities. They opened hospitals. They did all that was expected of royals of their generation.
They went on to have 2 children, Princess Elizabeth, born on the 21st of April 1926 at the Strathmore's London home, 17 Bruton Street, and Princess Margaret, born on the 21st of August 1930 at Glamis Castle.
I mean, it's incredibly lovely, the relationship between Bertie, Elizabeth, and the two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, us four. They were a wonderfully tight unit. And I think that the Queen Mother and Bertie were, you know, as good as parents as they could be, given their constraints. But Bertie had a particular passion for Margaret. It was always said that Elizabeth was his pride and Margaret was his joy. And in fact, Margaret understood his temperament. Margaret was terribly spoiled. I mean, she was a complete daddy's girl, but she was the only one who could soothe him when he got into what the family called one of his terrible gnashes, his kind of anxious, frustrated rages. And Margaret would be the one who could sort of tickle him out of those with humour and love and jokes. And he always gave Margaret an extra kiss.
He also founded the Duke of York summer camps with the intention of bringing boys from all backgrounds together to enjoy outdoor life and activities. The camps featured community singing, which he would enthusiastically join in. The York family became a tight unit during their years together. It is often said that George VI regarded Elizabeth as his pride and Margaret as his joy, looking upon the two girls with a huge amount of devotion and love. Because they weren't first in line for the throne, the family could shy away from the public's view.
George VI, when he was a younger man, was devoted to his wife Elizabeth, the Queen, and to their children Elizabeth and Margaret. He was not somebody who was seeking the limelight. He was not somebody who wanted to have his name up in lights. He was somebody who would have much preferred a quiet, simple family life.
(1936), the year that changed everything. On the 20th of January, King George V died suddenly at home in Sandringham House. The monarch's 25-year reign had seen the country through the First World War and the founding of the House of Windsor. However, with George V's last breath came chaos and instability.
George V was a king who had to deal with a series of crises that coloured his reign, ranging from the First World War to the rise of communism and fascism, the Great Depression, and latterly the fragmentation of the empire. He was a king who had to move with the times. He did so by presenting himself as a figure of duty, who took his responsibilities as king very seriously, who put the nation ahead of his own desires.
King Edward VIII ascended to the throne upon the death of his father. Though the young and fashionable king was much loved by the public, both palace and parliament were in agreement that he was not well suited to the job.
It has been an ancient tradition of the British monarchy that the new sovereign should send a message. Science has made it possible for me to make that written message more personal and to speak to you all over the radio. Feel that his death is not only an overwhelming grief to my mother and to us, his children, but that it is at the same time also a personal loss to you all. the vast crowd's speech to say that he reigned in the hearts of his people. It now falls upon me to succeed him and to carry on his work. I am better known to most of you as the Prince of Wales, as a man who has had the opportunity of getting to know the people of nearly every country of the world. And although I now speak to you as the King, I am still that same man whose constant effort it will be to continue to promote the well-being of his fellow men. May the future bring peace and understanding throughout the world, and may we be worthy of the heritage which is ours.
God save the King!
Well, when his father died, he greeted his father's death with absolute hysteria, and he was throwing things around and shouting and unable to respond to it. And I think a lot of people thought this was a very bad omen of what was to come, and they were proved right. Because Edward VIII is, in my opinion, the worst king who ever sat on the throne. He was somebody of quite a staggering self-absorption, mixed with a little light treachery. And I think that what he tried to do to the monarchy, if he had stayed on the throne any longer, would have systematically ruined it as an institution.
Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, was standing at a point-to-point with the courtier Tommy Lascelles, and Edward was doing one of his point-to-point rides, and Tommy Lascelles turned to Stanley Baldwin and said, "You know, sir, I often think that when we're waiting for the result of the point-to-point to come in, the best thing that could happen would be to hear that the Prince of Wales had fallen and broken his neck." And Baldwin replied, "God forgive me, so do I."
Even before Edward became king, there was a general sense that he was a security risk, and the main reason why he was seen as a security risk were that his links with the Nazi Party and his friendship with von Ribbentrop, who would later become British ambassador, were seen as enormous potential threats to national security. At a time of great international unrest, the last thing that Britain needed was a king whose personal and indeed political motives were seen as suspect.
The king had been having an affair with the twice-divorced American socialite, Wallis Simpson. In the year he became monarch, Edward VIII proposed to marry Wallis, an event which triggered a constitutional crisis across the British Empire.
When it became clear that Edward was thinking about abdicating the throne in order to marry Wallis Simpson, there was an enormously mixed reaction. You could essentially summarise it like this. The middle classes were horrified and disgusted because they saw the king having this relationship with a married woman, indeed a divorced woman, something that was completely unacceptable. The working classes didn't think anything of this. They thought it was absolutely fair enough, that they loved the king, they wanted him to be happy, and they were very, very keen that he remain on the throne.
Edward made a speech immediately after he abdicated to the British people via the BBC radio airwaves.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything, but until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. And you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. And now we all have the new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the King.
King George VI was crowned the following year in May 1937, the third and final king to reign in the year of 3 kings. The shy Bertie was thrust to the forefront of the royal family, and with him, his wife became queen, and his 2 young daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, became next in line to the throne. The Four's cosy family life changed dramatically from that moment onwards. Royal duty and devotion to the monarchy instead took precedence.
We know that Bertie, as Edward's younger brother, was very anxious about becoming king. He wasn't a public figure on the same level as his brother had been. He wasn't very good in front of the cameras. He struggled to make speeches. He was a reluctant monarch in that respect, and he knew that becoming king would mean that he had to put his home life, his family, on the back burner, that he had to embrace duty, responsibility now first and foremost.
Bertie was a better mould of king. He was going to be more dutiful. He had a more stoic, traditional wife in Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. In fact, Edward didn't cause collapse in the country. It was better for the country that he wasn't king.
George V is famed for having said of his son, Edward, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months. And I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." As the man who was never meant to be king, George VI felt overwhelmed with anxiety as he ascended to the throne in 1936. The new monarch's ongoing stammer compounded the precarious situation, and he worried about his adequacy for the huge task at hand.
In 1914, the call came, and the trial was made.
But with Elizabeth by his side, he had a constant source of strength and support throughout his reign.
I think that she was very good for him because he was nervous and anxious, and she was quite literally the power behind the throne.
Before the coronation, the Duke of York had stood out in his ordinariness, his wife friendly but dowdy. Following the coronation, all of that was to change. The new royal family was hurled into a hectic schedule, taking them to every corner of the British Dominion. With time, King George VI began to overcome his shyness, and he grew in confidence due to the ongoing support from Queen Elizabeth.
The memorial seems to me finally conceived and finally executed. It is fortunate also in the position it occupies. Standing as it does against the background of the castle, reminding us of the long and continuous history.
Queen and the princesses come out to welcome their guests in Windsor Great Park. And for almost the last time before they again disperse to the ends of the earth, the Dominion and colonial representatives who have attended the coronation take part in a royal ceremony. And of all the brilliant gatherings of the past few months, probably the memory of this one will outlast all the others. For led by His Majesty, each of the distinguished guests is to plant an oak tree, one for every component part of the empire. And henceforth this spot in Windsor Great Park is to be called Coronation Grove. And as the years will lift its branches skywards, they will be a living memorial in rustling greenness for this happy first year of a new reign.
When he became king, he accepted it. He accepted that it was his responsibility and that it was something that he would have to deal with. And the person that he had as his counsellor was Walter Monckton, who had also been Edward VIII's counsellor. Monckton was a lawyer who understood how things worked, and he was a very decent man. So the first thing that George VI did as king was to knight Walter Monckton. And he did it in his own private home in Piccadilly. And he said to Monckton as he was knighting him, "Well, Walter, I didn't do that very well, but it's the first time I've done it." And you can look at most of his reign up to the beginning of World War II as essentially that being a microcosm of it. You can see that he may not have done it very well, but it was the first time he'd done it. And although there are people who sneered at him, such as the diarist Chips Channon, for lacking glamour, for not being a charismatic figure, for his stutter, he was somebody who was trying his very best. And I think that's what you can see the king as being, somebody who was trying to be like his father, not like his brother.
The instincts for the fashions of the late 1930s didn't come naturally to Elizabeth, nor did she have the figure for it. Instead, she created her own unique style. She wore a fairy tale dress specially designed for her part as queen. But the times of bliss would only last so long. As the Munich crisis unfolded, the reality of war engulfed Great Britain.
The day that war was declared against Germany was a great moment of sadness and concern for the British public. They understood why this point had been reached, that Hitler had time and again broken promises, and as a result, Chamberlain and Chamberlain's government had been forced to declare war on Germany. In this moment of crisis, the British public, I think, were looking for leadership not just from the government, but also from the British royal family. They were looking for reassurance that everything would be okay and that the nation would get through this moment of peril.
In this grave hour, perhaps the most fateful in our history, I send to every household of my people, both at home and overseas, this message, spoken with the same depth of feeling for each one of you as if I were able to cross your threshold and speak to you myself. For the second time in the lives of most of us, we are at war.
Sure I am that this day, now, we are the masters of our fate. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender.
The popularity of the British royal family plummeted during the Second World War for a critical reason. This was a moment of austerity, rationing, control, and of blackouts, where ordinary members of the public were suffering hardships and couldn't access food and other necessities.
The British royal family were not that popular during the Second World War, and there's a key reason for this. This was a moment of austerity, of rationing, of controls, of blackouts, where ordinary members of the public, where civilians were suffering hardships, where they couldn't access ordinary foodstuffs, where normal opportunities were closed down to them. And there was quite a lot of antipathy and anger towards sort of elite sections of society who seemed to be able to continue with their lives in normal ways. So it was crucial that the British royal family be seen as though they are suffering because of this war as well. And the bombing of Buckingham Palace in that respect represented an opportunity to demonstrate that royalty, that crown and people were suffering together.
The King and Queen tirelessly visited the armed forces and bombed civilians and war factories. To those with shattered bones and bodies, a royal visit symbolised that the British nation knew and cared. Even the young princesses played their part in boosting the morale of the British citizens, notably in the 1940 BBC Children's Hour broadcast, where the young princesses Elizabeth and Margaret addressed the children of the Commonwealth. This was Elizabeth's first public speech, something she would have to get used to as she would soon have to address the nation and the world as Queen.
We know, every one of us, that in the end all will be well, for God will care for us and give us victory and peace. And when peace comes, remember, it will be for us, the children of today, to make the world of tomorrow a better and happier place. My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say good night to you. Come on, Margaret. Good night, children. Good night, and good luck to you all.
On the 13th of September 1940, shortly after Germany's bombing campaign on the towns and cities of Britain, 5 high-explosive bombs were dropped on Buckingham Palace. The Royal Chapel, Inner Quadrangle and Palace gates were hit, and several workers were injured. Rather than flee the city under attack, King George VI and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, remained at Buckingham Palace in solidarity with those living through the Blitz. This was a highly symbolic decision and received much attention in the press. Queen Elizabeth said, "I am glad we have been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." Hitler even referred to the Queen Mother as the most dangerous woman in Europe, as he watched her and King George VI hold out in Buckingham Palace despite bombs raining down on London.
Buckingham Palace was bombed on several occasions in World War II. The most spectacular one came relatively early in the war, when bombs landed sufficiently close to George VI and to Queen Elizabeth and to their Private Secretary Alec Harding, but if it hadn't been for a couple of minor bits of chance, they almost certainly would have been killed. And it's very interesting to see this, because whoever bombed Buckingham Palace knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly which parts of the palace the King and Queen would have been in. They knew exactly where to hit it. So there was clearly somebody working off some kind of intelligence, which was not intelligence that the general public would have had, and it's certainly not intelligence that Nazi Germany would have had. And the question that you have to ask is, how would you have got that intelligence, were it not for the fact there was somebody who was at loose, who would have been able to tell people exactly, if you wanted to bomb Buckingham Palace and kill my family, this is how you do it. And of course the question is, did Edward actually want to see George VI and the Queen killed? I don't know is the answer to that, because on the one hand, he didn't like his brother, he was angry with his brother, but was he actually a traitor? I don't know. But what I think you can say is that his acts, even if they were not committed with intentional treachery, certainly added up to treachery. The King and Queen were exceptionally nearly killed, and it was just a stroke of luck that they weren't. I mean, at one point, windows had been left open that probably wouldn't have been left open under normal circumstances. If the windows had been shut, they would have smashed into 1,000 pieces of glass, probably would have killed everyone in the room. After the palace was bombed, they're both absolutely terrified. The king wrote in his diary that he couldn't quite believe what had happened and that he was very lucky to have escaped. But days later, he's still writing, "I look outside, I can't forget seeing the bomb." It's quite clear that it had a kind of traumatic effect on both of them. What was very interesting was that, especially after Buckingham Palace was bombed and the King and Queen went out into the East End to see that they'd been bombed, and the Queen famously declared, "I'm glad we've been bombed because it makes me think I can look the East End in the face." There was a real sense of the traditional bounds coming down, a real sense that they were all in it together.
The King and Queen were very keen to emphasise a narrative that they, the royals, and the British public at large were all in this war together. There was a sense of shared sacrifice that united crown and people.
What you saw with the King and Queen was that they really were cheek by jowl with their subjects. I mean, they knew they could have been killed just as anyone else could have been. And although, of course, they did all these things with an eye for publicity, it was also something that they genuinely believed. They genuinely were sincere about the idea of wanting to be standing alongside their subjects who had been bombed, who were going through the same things they were, because obviously they knew they were just as likely, if not more likely, to be bombed than anybody else.
Once again, Londoners who have known nights of terror before return to their bombed-out homes. Britain's beloved monarchs are on the scene a short while after, again demonstrating a human sympathy for their subjects, whose courage has never yet been shaken. But king, queen, or humble citizen, all veterans of the Blitz, demonstrate once more that London can still take it.
On the 2nd of September 1945, World War II ended. The enemy who drove all of Europe into war had finally been overcome. On VE Day, the royal couple stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. Their daughters joined them before secretly wandering the streets of London and shouting with the crowd for the king to come forth. But the celebrations could only last so long. The king knew that he and his prime minister had the challenging task of rebuilding the country from the rubble. So many lives had been lost, and enormous economic and social deprivation existed.
The enemy who drove all Europe into war has been finally overcome. But at this hour, when the dreadful shadow of war has passed far from our hearths and homes in these islands, we may at last make one pause for thanksgiving and then turn our thoughts to the tasks all over the world which peace in Europe brings with it. First, and let us remember those who will not come back, their constancy and courage in battle, their sacrifice and endurance in the face of a merciless enemy. Let us remember the men in all the services, the women in all the services who have laid down their lives. We have come to the end of our tribulation, and they are not with us at the moment of our rejoicing.
The king always kept an optimistic and brave face for the sake of his people, despite knowing the dark truths of reality, a trait his eldest daughter Elizabeth idolized him for. However, the burden of being king can sometimes be too heavy to bear for just one man, leading to George's rapidly declining health.
The King and Queen appear for a great reception, with Princess Elizabeth, now 19, and Princess Margaret Rose, now 15 years old. Today, Britain, emerging from the war with a proud sense of duty well done, faces the grave problems of peace.
The British people welcomed the end of the Second World War. Fathers, brothers and sons could come home again. However, with peacetime comes new challenges, new instabilities, and new ways of thinking. The British Empire crumbled away, and the role of the British monarch began to change.
The First and Second World Wars were disastrous for the British Empire in that they put huge pressures on the British economy. It's also the case that during the Second World War, many men come from the colonies to fight on behalf of the motherland, to fight on behalf of Britain against the forces of fascism. They believe they're fighting for democracy, for the ideals of independence and freedom. And yet, after the war is won, they return to their homes in the colonies and they still don't have their own freedom and independence. And there's something of a contradiction there, which really spurs on these independence movements in their drive for full independence. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the British Empire rapidly transitioned into the modern Commonwealth of Nations. key moment of change involving the king is with the London Declaration of 1949, where he is given the title Head of the Commonwealth. So whereas he was once an emperor, he now has this more diffuse title, this less well-defined title, but nevertheless it's a key symbolic role at the heart of this new thing we call Commonwealth.
With Queen Elizabeth by his side, George VI became the first monarch to hold the title Head of the Commonwealth. He endeavoured to unify the member nations, promote equality across the former British colonies, and leave a lasting legacy for his heir. King George's health rapidly declined in the immediate years after the war. Conscious of his lack of time, he endeavoured to prepare Elizabeth for the greatest duty of her life.
I think it's fair to say that the two things that destroyed George's health and led him to an early death were first of all his becoming king at all, and secondly the sheer stress of what he had to do in World War II, because if a war had never happened, if a peace had been sought with Hitler that had then been agreed, he may have lived longer, but he was faced with the most horrendous stress and pressure. You can understand why. If you've been faced with that level of trauma, it's not going to be something you can walk away from very easily.
George VI, who had, as a young man, often suffered from ill health, became quite ill as a result of the Second World War. The stress of the conflict told on him. He was a heavy smoker, and by 1945, his health was actually very poor.
George knew that he was very ill towards the end of his life. He knew that he was a committed cigarette smoker. He was somebody who'd always drunk quite heavily as well. He was somebody who knew that his health was not great. But on the other hand, he was being told by his doctors that operations that he'd had were successful. I mean, he had a large portion of his lung removed, that he was going to be okay. So the fact that he was dying was kept from him, but it was also commonly known within the wider echelons of the courtiers that he didn't have all that long, and that Elizabeth was likely to become queen far before anyone could have reasonably expected.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. But I shall not have strength to carry out this resolution alone unless you join in it with me.
On the 20th of November 1947, George VI's heir and firstborn daughter married Prince Philip Mountbatten of Greece and Denmark. But when the young princess embarked on a tour of Kenya with her husband in 1952, she never expected to return as queen.
Now the Princess Elizabeth we knew and loved returns amongst us as our queen. Before her plane, her government and leaders of the other parties receive her greeting. No queen had ever such councillors so predetermined to give of their best. No queen had ever such a people so devoted.
King George VI passed away in his sleep at the Sandringham estate on the 6th of February 1952, only 7 years after the largest conflict in history had drawn to a close. His sudden death broke hearts everywhere, and the nation mourned its beloved king.
For the Queen, his daughter, the widowed Queen, his wife, as George VI returns to his sorrowing capital. And with it, on the oak coffin, is the white wreath of his widow.
George's passing was a profound loss for his wife, Elizabeth. At the age of 51, she was devastated by the passing of her great love and partner. Despite her grief, she found renewed purpose in supporting the new monarch, her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II. Her resilience and dedication to the royal family and her country during this challenging time further solidified her legacy as a pillar of strength and continuity for the British monarchy.
200 years have wrought an immense transformation in the civilization of the world.
Elizabeth lived on for more than half a century. She continued to raise her daughters with the same values that George had ruled with. Reaching the grand old age of 101, the mother of the house represented not only Britain and the Empire, but also a whole century of human history. On her death, people talked of the end of an era, of things never being the same again, of Britain changing forever.
The Union flag at Windsor was flying at half-mast. Later, people began arriving there in a steady stream to lay flowers and leave their own messages of tribute to the woman who had become the supreme symbol of the 20th century and part of the fabric of this nation and the Commonwealth.
Though their life together was cut short, Elizabeth's love for George never faded. They remain one of the most significant royal couples in British history, whose partnership was crucial in preventing the collapse of the monarchy and maintaining stability and hope across the nation.